Hi everyone, this is Eric Toledo. I am the New Hampshire State Lead from RCAP Solutions, and we are we developed this training session in collaboration with the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, DES, and it was designed to address the challenges faced by manufacturer home communities or co-ops on providing drinking water and wastewater services. This is how the agenda looks like for today's training. We're going to talk a little bit about technical, managerial, and financial challenges faced by cooperatives, and we're going to invest some time in talking about the business plan structure, a little bit about the asset inventory, and the fiscal sustainability plan. Your presenter, the people that will be introducing or the instructor for this training will be from DES, Shelley Frost, Sarah Ringard, and for the RCAP solution, Eric Toledo and Martin Estrella. For testing and training requirement, please email Sarah Ringard for certification form, and you can see her contact information on the screen. And for the test result, you can contact me at etoledo@rcapsolution.org. And with that, I will give the floor to Shelley Frost, which is going to be responsible for the first presentation. So,
thank you, Eric. I'm going to jump right into my presentation. I just wanted to mention that the test that Eric had mentioned is a post test, just to verify that you've stayed to do the whole presentation. And as he mentioned, you'll be sending that to him. That post test is found on the same website as this video. And so let's get started. We're going to discuss today, before we get into the mechanics of the business plan, a little bit about the technical, managerial, and financial capacity issues, as Eric mentioned, that face small water systems. I'm going to present about the technical issues, and Eric's going to go on to other, the financial and the managerial and the financial topics. The reason that we're bringing this up is because as a recipient of funding, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act, requires that we can only provide funding if the systems already have the capabilities that you need to make your water system sustainable. Or if you don't, that the use of these funds will ensure that you will have the technical, managerial, and financial capabilities that you need to be able to comply with all the regulations over the long term and basically to be self-sustaining as a public water system without future funding help. What is technical capacity? It's basically the capability to do all of the technical things that you need to do to keep your water system running. And that addresses not only your staff availability and staff abilities, but also your public water system technical abilities. So these requirements rest in the drinking water and groundwater regulations. There are regulations that explicitly state what owners must do for public water systems and what operators must do for public water systems. In addition, we have other requirements in two other sets of regulations. They're very brief and very readable. The ones that I just mentioned are in ENV DW 502, which covers water system owner responsibilities and operational duties of primary water system operators. ENV DW 503 mentions the operational requirements, and 504 mentions the maintenance requirements. So it's easy to remember 503 and 504 is operation and maintenance in sequence. You can find these online. I'm not going to go into the search engine. I just know that you can look at this slide and find out where to download that information. I'm going to touch on only a few things on these slides. I want to give you all the information on the slides, but I'm only going to touch on a few at this point because we want to jump into the business plan as soon as we can. First and foremost, for public water system owners, your responsibility, either as a private owner or as a member of the board of directors or board of commissioners, is to comply with all drinking water rules and with the public water law under RSA 485. The things that come up as a technical assistance for me are that you need to make sure that any operating personnel make process control decisions about the water quality or quantity, that those operating personnel is either your primary operator or has authorization to work on the system's water quality or water quantity from your primary operator. And that includes any contractors. So if your contractor is working on anything that affects the water quality or quantity, then that operator needs to notify your primary operator before starting to work on the water system. Finally, you need to fully maintain the operational readiness of the system and promptly replace failing components. You're required to have a maintenance schedule for each water system component. You need to conduct and document required inspections. Inspections are required every 7 days in your pump house for treatment that has mechanized equipment. And if you have no treatment equipment that's mechanized, you only need to inspect every 30 days. You also need to issue notifications of impairments to your regulatory agency, us, the DES. You can call me if you like. And if an impairment continues for 48 hours, you have to inform your residents, your water users. Not only do you need to let them know that there is an impairment, which they probably will have guessed, but you need to give them some sense of what you're doing about it and when you expect it to be fixed. You also need to let your water users know about planned outages and any flushing of the water system that you're planning. Flushing is supposed to happen typically once every 2 years or more frequently as needed. You need to evaluate the adequacy of your water supply and treatment every once in a while to make sure that it's continuing to, that the wells are continuing to give the yield that they did when you first installed them, and so that you can make plans if they're losing yield to replace them. Please do consult with us if your production rates are declining. I discussed what an impairment is. You can take a look at that. These are other requirements in maintenance. You need to flush your system, as I mentioned. You should turn your valves, your isolation valves, your flushing valves, at least once every 12 months, or at least 1/5 of them every year. You're supposed to maintain your storage tank, keep it painted, have it inspected if you've never inspected it and it's a 30-year-old tank. Please make plans to inspect it. It can accumulate a lot of sediment at the bottom. You also need to maintain and update on an annual basis your water system's record drawings. A record drawing is the water system map. So if you change something in the water system, you need to reflect that on the map. Say you replaced a length of pipe, you should note it on the map and preferably put a date on that, and also enter it into your maintenance log. So those are owner requirements. What about your primary operator's requirements? Well, your primary operator needs to conduct the routine inspections of the public water system, as I mentioned. I know that with contracts, sometimes operators will visit the system every 90 days, which is allowed if there's no maintenance, but they have to check your records because you'll need to be checking the pump house and looking at the meters and recording the meter readings if they're not doing it. and you need to do that on a 30-day basis. So even though they can come quarterly, they need to check your records during that quarterly visit. They need to oversee operation and maintenance of the public water system. They have to be knowledgeable about your specific water system. They need to have supervisory authority where applicable. For instance, if you have a facility manager who wants to turn off the water, that facility manager really needs to talk to the I just call it a PO, to your primary operator, before doing that, because sometimes things happen, such as creating water hammers that can damage the water system. So anything that affects most of the water quality and most of the water quantity in your water system, talk to the PO first. They also oversee all chemical, bacteria, and other required monitoring. They have to attend all sanitary surveys conducted by the DES for non-transient systems, assuming you're a non-transient system representative. They also have to keep complete and accurate public water system records and be available to your representatives and to us, the DES, during business hours. They should investigate any suspected water system impairment and notify us of any impairment. I would qualify that any impairment that affects most of the water system or a substantial part of the water system. If it affects one house, we don't need to know, but if it affects several homes, it's best to let us know what the impairment is. And so I've already gone through most of these. I'm going to skip ahead. As I mentioned, you can delegate inspections to someone knowledgeable of the facilities and functions that require action or maintenance, and you have to use a certified operator to address pressure reducing faults, air release faults. This is under 503 operation regulations and what the inspections need to include and how often they need to happen, which I have mentioned. Every 30 days for treatment without mechanical chemical addition for you, but for the primary operator, if there's no mechanical addition, that can be every 90 days and looking at your 30-day visits. If there is mechanical addition, as I mentioned, it's 7 days that the pump house should be inspected. It's recommended. And it's actually in our regulations as required. But we have a little give and take on that. Inspection log requirements. You need to keep an inspection log, and inspection can include inspections for repair and maintenance, as well as the regular 7-day or 30-day inspection requirements. Your primary operator should communicate to you about any non-compliance issues that your water system has. And if you have designated a manager for your water system, your primary operator should also let the manager know, preferably in writing. This is to help ensure that the repairs and improvements are performed properly and in a timely manner. So that takes care of my portion for now. Eric is going to cover the managerial and financial capacity topics next.
Thank you very much, Shelly. So I'm going to make myself a presenter now. And
Sounds
I'm going to
good.
share my presentation with you guys. All right. Can you see it?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tips or recommendations that or steps that you can undertake in order to improve your management and financial capabilities. So let's start first with the management capacities, and this is referring not only for drinking water system but for wastewater system as well. So the first thing that you need to know, that you need to be aware, is that as a board you are responsible for all these issues. You are the guards against misuse or misappropriation of funds, routinely manage on-site staff if you have any, or any of your contractors, including the operators, electricians, plumbers, drillers. Um, you get to know very well. We recommend you to get very well your physical asset and review your budget so you can have a good understanding of how your works, how your system works, and what is your financial position, and understand a little bit about the expenditures. How much it will cost to run the system, both in a day-to-day basis and a long term. And clarifications if you need it. We understand, everybody knows that managing a water or drinking water system or a wastewater system is a complex undertaking, so asking questions is not a bad thing. The second step, or the first step that we're going to recommend you, is to review your bylaws. Remember that the board has no control over the federal or state regulations. This is something that the rules are created by the government. So federal and state regulations are not something that you can modify. However, as a board, you have control to oversee the establishment of your rules or the bylaws. So what we recommend is to create an effective set of bylaws. And by that, we mean what is written in this slide. The second step that we recommend is to understand very well your budget. The budget is telling you, or is trying to tell you a real story about how your system funds and works financially. However, for many of us, the story is too dry, it's too boring, it's hard to understand. It's coded in a language that may be difficult for somebody that is not an accountant to get. So very often we don't get and we don't understand that story. So what is important to do is to get familiar with the structure of your budget. Your budget is a comparison between 2 consecutive years. And usually the revenue is included first at the top of the budget, and is followed by the revenue or the expenses. Other thing that you have to keep in mind is that usually you have only one source of income, while you have a number of expenses that you have to deal with. So keep that in mind. And the other thing that is very important also is to understand that there are some operational and not operational expenses that you have to deal with. Reserves, for instance, they are not an operational expenses, but is a non-operational expenses that you have to cover. The next step will be monitoring your expenses very carefully. Emergency repairs are usually significant for cooperatives with systems that have 40, 50 years old. So, they are basically above the time for which they were designed. So it's important to review your budget in a regular basis. Watch for all those expenses that, have an impact in your budget, including electricity, chemicals for disinfections, emergency repairs, particularly those ones are very important, insurance, and some others. Review your rates. If the response for any of these 5 questions is no, that there are very good chances that you need to adjust, change, or increase your rates. Fees change over time for multiple reasons, such the inflation factor, depreciation of your asset, seasonal changes, and some others. You need also to work a little bit, and this is step number 5, to identify your funding sources. And there are not too many of them. Your customers are probably the most consistent and important ones. And what you need to figure it out is how much they can afford to pay for the services. If you don't know that, if you wanted to have an idea, completing an income survey is probably the best way to go, and we can provide some information about that. Grants, it's everybody love grants, but receiving grants could be a very competitive propositions, because there's everybody that is trying to get access to those funding sources. And finally, loans, they are expensive and need to be paid back to the funders. So that means that the costs need to be transferred to your customers. So explore some other customers' affordability before you loan for shops. And finally, the communication strategy. Audience with the audience of your system is, there are different stakeholders. The regulators, the media could be one of them, of course, your customers, and the system board and employees are part of it. So cultivating communication with the state authorities, the New Hampshire DES, it's something that we recommend, and communication with your user through mechanisms such as the annual consumer or confidence report, and understand a little bit about what are your users' situation needs. If you have a high percentage of retirees, low income, a whole bunch of vacant homes, so you should be able to develop a communication strategy based on that information. And here is just a summary of the different sources that might be available for you at your request. And from that, I'm gonna move very quickly to my second presentation, which is about the financial capability. Okay, so there we go. So as I did it before with the management, we will just give you some tips on how to improve your financial performance. I think that the point that we want to make is that wastewater services is a business operation because, as a definition of a business, it's an economic operation where goods and services are exchanged for money. So if you are taking revenue from your customers, if you have to pay expenses, if you deliver a product or service, if you have an agreement with your customers and you are regulated by the government, you are basically in a business operation. So you have to run your operations as a business. And that starts with understanding your budget, which I explained in the previous presentation. But also, it's important to just spend a couple of minutes to talk about budgets like this. This is a real community here, a small utility in New Hampshire. So they have some significant expenses because they have an old system and they have a number of leaks that consumes like a relatively large amount of your budget. What we recommend them to do is to review their budget in a quarterly basis so they will know, what happened every 3 months at least. And the revenue, for instance, in this case was a little short and the expenses were beyond the budget allocation for the year 2020. So just keep an eye on that. The other thing that is step number 2 is about the building your reserves. It is not really uncommon to see that small systems don't put enough money aside to invest in the utility short-term and long-term needs. And here are some of the examples of the most common reserves that ideally you will have available already in your system. If not, you should be implementing. The next one is the financial monitoring. It's not enough creating a budget and setting a plan, but the job of monitoring starts really at this point when the monitoring starts, your system finances begins right here. And there are some different documents and different tools that you can use in order to do that. Budget monitoring, understanding of your statements, your audits if you have to perform one of them. That will help you to adjust your budgets in case of you need to do some changes. One of the things, the balance sheet is one of the very important monitoring tools that you might have available that will give you an idea of what your situation is. And what it is basically a combination of the assets and liabilities and equity in one single table. Just you have to keep a look on certain things like the inventory, certain expenses that usually doesn't happen very often, like in this case, a line of credit, and long-term debt. So those are the things that you probably wanted to take a look of that. In the case of the cash flow, I think it will give you, it's a tool that will give you an idea of the cash flow analysis, to understand, when you are going to run out of money. In this case, for instance, you have the cash flow from January to December, and you can see by the month of February, this system already running into the red numbers. The other thing is, check your indicators. There is a number of indicators that have been developed by different accounting gurus, and they can give you an idea of what your financial situation looks like or your financial position is. So one of them is the revenue, checking your revenue versus your operational expenses. So that will give you something that is called operating ratio, and that will give you some information about your system. In this case, it's telling me that this system is in financial distress. And your accountant or whoever you have as a provider for your budget review, and it's somebody that you can ask those questions about what those indicators are. The important thing is to have and establish or create a reporting system which will work internally. So you have your documents that we mentioned before, like your balance sheet, the income statement, and the budget, and some external reporting that might be required by the state, the federal government, or perhaps the funding institutions that you are borrowing money from. And of course, it's something that will help you to inform, your customers and help you to build trust from them. So with that, this is the last part of my presentation. And from here, we're going to move to the business plan structure, which I think Shelley will be responsible for that. So Shelley, I will make you a presenter. Are you a presenter? Yes, you are a presenter.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Eric. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Okay, thanks. So at this point, we're just going to dive into the business plan, which is a necessary plan, one of the required documents for the completion of your SRF loan. The preliminary one is due ideally before you take out the loan, and then a final one after the construction is in its final stages of completion. And so you would present this at that point in time. I'm just going to show you what the different tabs are. We have A through I, and A is a technical summary. You can get help from your operator to complete that. And the second one, which is very time consuming, is your asset inventory. It's a listing of at this point in time for your preliminary plan, would be your major assets. And the operator and the board can help you with that. The part C is another tab in the Excel spreadsheet, which tells you your funding strategy. That collects information from your asset inventory and from your expenses tab down here, and combines them to help summarize what work you likely will have to be doing in the near and later future that you'll want to plan for. Part D is a managerial summary, and your board president can summarize that. So not sure what your role is with filling out this business plan, but as you see, there are persons on your board and your primary operator to help you complete each tab in this Excel series of spreadsheets in this Excel file called the business plan. So your secretary should be able to help with the organizational chart, and your treasurer can help you, or can actually do this for you, fill out annual expenses, the revenues that you bring in, a summary of the debt that your water system carries. And the water rate is something that can be used as a tool by the board. There are some calculations that are automatically done in that, but you would need to have some information too, and I will go over that. First and foremost is your first tab, your cover sheet, actually business plan cover page, as you can see down here. And if this is the first time you've attempted this, it will be your preliminary plan. And after your project, it will be your final plan, or which would be right here actually. Oops, sorry about that. Let me go back. It would be your funding improvements. And I just want to note here that with the funding improvements, what I'd like you to do is to fill out this plan as if all the work for your loan or your grant has been completed. So this plan will be applicable to your water system once the construction is done. And I'll tell you where that fits in a minute. What would change because of that in this plan. So for the technical summary, you'll want help from your board of directors and your operator. The number of service connections you have, that's how many water users, how many residences you have connected, as well as perhaps some other things if you have clubhouse or you have a field with a yard faucet in it or something like that. Here you see the word current, and over here the word build out. So build out means once all of your lots are completely developed, as you would expect them to be, how many water users would you have? And some systems might be completely built out, and they might have been built out for decades, but we just want to know what point you're at. If you're at 50 connections and 50 is all that you can add to your water system, then your build out number would also be 50. The population served is assumed to be 2.5 persons per connection. And the water system design flow is where your primary operator can help. Now, I have more instructions about this in our second presentation, but you can also contact the state to find out what your design flow is if you don't know. Your average daily demand is something your primary operator should be able to tell you. It's just basically how much water is used on the average at your water system. I would ask that you base that on a year of record keeping, a year of meter records. And then we would also like to know, if you keep this sort of information, what your maximum daily demand is. So your max day would be dependent on how frequently you keep your records. If you keep them weekly, it would be the weekly record that is the highest in the past year. If you keep them monthly, it would be the highest monthly number, but you would divide it by 30, just as if it was a weekly recording of the meter records, you would use the highest water use for the week, but divide it by 7 to get the max day. So you would get that for how many connections you currently have, and then you could just do a straight calculation. If you have a few more lots to add, you would divide that number by the current number of connections and multiply it by your maximum number of connections at build out and put that number over here. Feel free to call to ask questions about this. Your source capacity is basically what your community well can provide, and if your well was put in after the regulations became promulgated, we will have that information available. So it's basically what is the flow rate in gallons per minute as derived from a pump test. And it's nice to know if you happen to know how long your pump test lasted, but if you don't worry about it. Then we'd like you to check what type of water system you are. Are you residential? Do you have any commercial users on your water system, industrial, school, daycare, or other? Most folks who come to us for funding and that will fill this out because it's a requirement of the funding are residential water systems, also known as community water systems. You would describe your water treatment here. If you don't know how to describe it, you can get help from your primary operator, or you can take a look at your sanitary survey letter. We conduct sanitary surveys of your water systems every 3 years for non-transient systems. So you could just take a look at that, give us a call if you'd like to know, and we can send you a copy of your letter. And you can use that as a description to put in here for what your water treatment system is, if you have one. Here we have a little bit of notation about what about your wastewater? Is it septic? Is it sewer? Are there shared septic systems? That sort of thing. Here is a large screenshot of the asset inventory. This is Part B, and it basically lists several types of assets that most water systems have. Feel free to revise this and get rid of things that you do not have in your water system. This is just to help prompt you. Most folks have bedrock wells, so I would just note, say you have 2 bedrock wells, I'd say bedrock well, it might be BRW1 and BRW5, or BRW2 or BRW3. I would remove the dug well if you have 2 bedrock wells. Just put your second well in here. When we say capacity or size, this one just basically lists its depth, and that's what you would do here. You would want to put in the year installed. And these are pre-filled columns, the low estimated useful life and the high estimated useful life. And the low and the high remaining useful life are derived from subtracting these numbers from the year, or adding these numbers to the year it was installed. And what you're basically doing is subtracting the age. So I cover this in more detail in the second presentation as well. The important thing about this, about this particular slide to remember is to, at first, just include your most important assets. And right now, all I want to do is let you see this for a minute and see what's coming up, and get help from your operator and any board of directors that really know your system to help fill out what your assets are. We'll go over this in much, much more detail in a few minutes. Part C of the business plan is the funding strategy. As I mentioned before, it takes the top critical assets from your asset inventory and lists them here. And also we have a subtotal of your annual expenses here to help tidy up in one area what costs you have and what costs are likely coming up for you, to help you plan for the future. So we've covered the business plan cover page, the text summary, the asset inventory, and this funding strategy in the Excel file. We'll be continuing on to the right with the tabs. The next tab is Part D, your managerial summary. Your owner, if you're a board member, is the president of the board or the president of the board of directors or the board of commissioners. You would have that person's mailing address, phone number, and email. You decide what type of ownership, who the governing body is, and just answer a few other very easy questions. So that's Part D, your managerial summary. Part E is your org chart. Your secretary can help with this. If you do have a facility manager, please include that person's contact information. Part F is another tab that lists your expenses for your last fiscal year and what you have budgeted for the next fiscal year. It also includes debt service. So if your funded project is going to end this year, you would expect to start some debt service next year, and so you would have an entry here. We have filled this with several types of standard expenses for water systems. Please do include tank inspections in your plans. Please include any meter calibrations if you need. And flushing or an annual leak survey if you're having leakage issues come up fairly routinely. So this is just to prompt you to plan for the future, but also just to help you fill things out. SCADA is telemetry. It means remote monitoring. If you have SCADA or remote monitoring or telemetry, you'll likely know that and know what some of the costs with that are. If you don't, then you can leave this particular line blank. We also have a tab for your revenues. So as Eric mentioned, the fiscal planning is needed, and this helps you plan fiscally for the future. That's why we call it a business plan. And so we need to know your revenues. Now, most small systems don't charge separately for their water. And that can really only be done if your water system has service or residential meters. If you don't, then what you'll want to do is set your revenues equal to your expenses. So under user charges, you would just write in for the year the expenses for the year. And your treasurer can help you with this. Part H is just a summary of all your debt, who the lender is, what the date of the loan is, what the original amount was, what the interest rate is, what the term of the loan is, and what its current balance is. All of this will be readily available to you through your treasurer. And finally, Part I is a way to calculate your water rate for systems that have service meters. If you don't have service meters, the only thing this really does for you is allow you to calculate a cost per gallon of water. You would enter the date with the meter reading here for your one well, and if you have more than one well, you'd enter a date for your second well. If you have 3 wells, you'd have to do these calculations elsewhere. So you'd choose 2 dates about a year apart and get the days in the period. So you'd have a meter reading here, a meter reading here, and the dates on which those meter readings were taken, which will be about a year apart by design. Then you'd find out the days in the period, and you would be able to find the annual number of gallons used by your water system. That would allow you to divide it by the number of households, and you would get an annual water use per connection number, which can be interesting and might be useful for discussions with your water users about how much their water actually costs compared to other utilities they pay. And you can also get at the cost of the water per gallon. Also can be useful to discuss with your water users. That's just an example. You can look at that in your own time. There's also a wastewater Fiscal Sustainability Plan, which will be presented following review of this asset inventory, which I'm going to go into next. So since this is a videoed presentation, I won't ask you to open your business plan now, but if you'd like to, feel free to while I switch over to a different presentation. You will probably recall this lineup of tabs on the business plan, and the plan we'll be looking at is the asset inventory. This inventory will help you determine which assets are most likely to fail, and even more importantly, what is the consequence if they do fail. The thing you want to do with this tab, Part B, is to start by listing your assets. You can use only the highlighted rows shown here, which are the most expensive items for a preliminary plan. The most expensive items includes your wells, your pump house. If you have a hydropneumatic tank, which is not a pressure tank, it's a very large, thick steel tank that is pressurized, holds 1,000 gallons typically or more, and your atmospheric storage tank. If you do have filtration, if you have treatment, that can be very expensive. It wouldn't hurt to use that. And also your distribution mains. And you can list these by street, but it's good to know what their diameter is and what they're made of. So your distribution system is actually the most expensive component of your water system. And that's because it requires excavation, the correct type of backfill so that your pipes are kept safe and will work over the long term, and the pipes themselves. The second thing you want to do after you list your assets, and by the way, feel free to remove anything that is not one of your assets from this business plan and just list the assets that you do have. The second thing you want to do is to list the year installed for each of your assets. If you don't know the exact age, but you know that the system was built about 45 years ago, you can simply put the year that is equivalent to about 45 years ago in for these items. Wells get replaced more frequently than entire streets of distribution main, so you might just want to check, and you can check with us. You can also check online at the DES one-stop search engine and just look up your public water system ID there, and you should be able to find information about your well under your public water system information. So far you'll have your assets listed, the years that they were installed, and then based on your asset age, you want to use this circle column here, which is the estimated useful life range, to find out what the low remaining useful life is and the high remaining useful life is of your asset. Now, let's pretend that you're actually replacing your bedrock well and that you also do have a gravel pack well. Well, in that event, what you would use for the year installed would be perhaps 2023 if this will be installed next year, or 2022 if it's being installed in 2022. That means its useful life is actually between 25 and 45 years old. So you would note 25 to 45 here. In this case, this is a 5-year-old well, so we're taking 5 years away from its estimated useful life. Now, these costs are a little bit aged at this point because of COVID and supply chains and all the economic ramifications of the pandemic. Costs have gone up. So I would recommend that you basically only use the high typical range for your estimated replacement cost. At this point, then you would then look at the condition of your assets. So you would want to fill out this column, condition, score 1 to 5. You can do that using a guidance tab that I'll show you in a moment that's in the business plan. And you can also check that with direct input from your operator, who probably has a pretty good idea about the condition of your assets, your water system assets. This is a very simplified version. It's just much easier to look at. So when I mention the condition score, you see that we have a ranking for you to use, which ranges from 1, which means excellent, to 5, which is a very poor condition. And we also have another column for the impact of failure. So what if you have a curb stop or you have a service connection that's in very poor condition? Will the impact of that failure affect water supply or water quality to most of your water users? No, it will not. So it would be a very insignificant score, or number 1. However, if the problem was, say, with your tank, your only tank, and it sprung a big leak and you needed that tank in order to supply water to your water users because your well only makes a little bit of water, then that would be a catastrophic experience, and you would want to assign that a impact of failure score of 5. So what happens once you do all of these once you assign these scores, is that you can assign a criticality. You multiply the condition score by the impact of failure to get at how critical, a very easy critical evaluation of the criticality of that asset. That is, how critical is it to give it attention in the near term. And so what I like to do once I've filled out a business plan is to rank, is to rearrange these in terms of highest criticality to lowest criticality. But it's not really necessary. But once you go through your assets and you assign these scores, then you can find out, it will pop out, those with the highest criticality scores are those that need to be addressed. And hopefully those will be the issues that are being addressed with your funding application, with your funded project. But if not, it will tell you then what you need to focus on after the project is done. So we'll just move on. This is attachment 1. It's the furthest right tab in the Excel file that is the business plan. And it helps you evaluate the condition of your assets. For instance, let's take a look at pipe, the water pipe in your distribution system. For a given street, it's best to just list your pipes by street because that's often how they're fixed, street by street. You might just have one loop, or you might have dozens of streets. But per street, what are the number of leaks or breaks in the past 5 years? It's very poor if a stretch of pipe has had more than 4 leaks or breaks per mile. Most small water systems are about 1.5 miles, have about 1.5 miles of pipe. Of course, that varies and can vary widely, but the average has about 1 mile to 1.5 miles of pipe. So as you see here, you can evaluate the condition of the pipe by the number of breaks per mile in the past 5 years. So you have a very poor stretch of pipe if it has more than 4 leaks or breaks per mile. You might be able to even look at a closed circuit TV inspection of your pipe. Most small systems can't. But if you're one of those rare systems, it could give you information too. Are there clean pipe walls, no illegal connections, no visible leaks? Good means only minor tuberculation or buildup on the pipe walls, no illegal connections, no visible leaks, and so on and so forth. So this is very explicit, and it should be a very useful tool to you for evaluating the condition of your assets. So in our live presentation, we would just ask everybody to start taking a look at their assets and their asset conditions and see what they can find out. And I'm going to return to this example asset inventory because I want to show you more about what it does for you. So you know the length, you know its remaining useful life. In this situation, if you're replacing your entire distribution system, your remaining useful life would be the useful life of it after the construction project that is funded is completed. So this will help you going forward, not looking backward. That's our goal, to help you look forward and plan for the future. However, let's say that your distribution system repair was not in the funded project, then you would be looking at needing to address that soon. And you would have an estimated replacement cost at 1.5 miles or 7,920 feet of $792,000, for instance. So how would you pay for that? Well, apparently you would take out another loan. And if your system is new and you've taken out this loan, so let's say you have a 50-year lifespan, you would then just divide that cost of replacement, which you will have because it was just replaced in this scenario, and you would divide it by the number of years of life it has left to get at what you should put aside annually to be able to pay for it in 50 years or whatever. So that's the goal, is to come out with an idea of how much money would you really have to spend to be able to, would you have to put away each year to make sure that you have money set aside for when you need it, for when something fails. For all of these items, for the new distribution system, for the service connections and service lines to the residences, for a new well, a new well is not part of this because it's still got 25 years of replacement of life back before it needs to be replaced. The steel water storage tank is considered to be in good condition, so you don't have any intended loan amount for it in the near term. It's got one of these two things have the lowest criticality scores. But let's say that the whole pump house doesn't need to be replaced just yet. Actually, it does. It's got the highest criticality score here. Sorry about that, 25. But what's critical in it is only $50,000 worth of loan. Either you've got some other money set aside, or the critical part is only $50,000. Maybe it's a couple of booster pumps or something. So let's take a look at these costs. These look pretty scary, right? They add up to $1 million almost. What would the monthly water rate be if you have 125 connections to pay for this? So what I've done is look at a 30-year loan based on a 2% interest rate, and found out that the annual payment divided by 125 connections would only be $30 a month. That's not quite so scary, is it? It's hard for folks with low incomes, and yet $30 a month is a typical phone payment. So it helps put everything in context, that yes, it is possible to keep up your water system. Now let's look at this. What if you say, well, we want to be self-sustainable? You know, there are going to be more hurricanes and things in the future. We're not necessarily going to have funding for our water system. What do we need to do now to be able to always be able to fix our water system when it needs to be fixed to the best of our estimation? Like, well, if you were to use a straight line division of the replacement cost over the lifetime of the asset, this is how much you would set aside yearly to be able to replace it when you estimate that the asset will fail. And that means you'd have an increase of $22.41 if you were to put aside money every year, so you'll be ready whenever something happens. What does that mean in terms of a total cost per year increase? That's $51.94 per connection to be able to make your system be self-sustainable and to bring it up from a pretty dire situation where your distribution system is kaput, your pump house is in need of some repair, and your service lines and service connections need to be replaced. That's a lot of work. And so if you had 125 connections, that would rate at about $52 a month to help make you sustainable into the future. That's $623 a year per connection. So that's something to work with. Is that something you can do? If not, then you're going to need to build up a reserve. That's what that annual reserve is. And I just want to encourage you to create a strategic capital reserve and consider how much it is you think you will need to put aside. The total is $33,620 a year in this example. Can you do that? Can you do that annually? Well, if you can't, then you need to look a little bit deeper. What equipment should you maintain? What can you keep going a bit longer? What should you just run to failure and replace? For instance, hydropneumatic tanks can be replaced with variable frequency drives that are a little less expensive in the short run, although you'd want to take a look at their electrical costs to make sure they're right for your system. When do you want to intervene along the asset's lifestyle? So really, it's looking closer at whether, what you can do to make yourself sustainable and do it in the most cost-effective way possible. Do you want to repair, replace, rehabilitate, or reconfigure your water system? But by doing this, you can save up to 15% of the costs, because you'll have supplies that you need. You'll have the fiscal ability that you need to avoid the emergency with planned maintenance, with planned repairs, and monies to be able to replace the assets. So you can translate this knowledge into a capital investment plan, your funding strategy, and your consumer communications. And again, this is just the same annual reserve column that I showed in the simplified version. And we even have abilities to help you figure out how much you need if you can assume that you're going to undergo inflation, but we're not going to get into that here. You can talk to me separately if you'd like to about that. So the next part of this is the funding strategy. And you would be using your top 3 critical, your items with the top 3 criticality scores in here, and your most expensive items in here. Then you would take the annual reserve from Part B. This is Part B, the asset inventory. So you would take the numbers for the annual reserves for these items and put them in here. And you say, well, we're not going to save that much money every year. That's just not possible for us right now. Then what you can do is you can say, well, we're going to use an alternate annual reserve amount to fund this item, and we'll figure out another way to fund it. It might be a loan that you will plan to take. It might be, and if it is, then you can write the amount of loan here and when you're going to take it. Or it might be a water rate or rent increase, lot rent increase. And if you're going to do that, you can put the date here and the amount and any comments you want to add to this. So here are your comment numbers. You can put in the appropriate numbers here and put your numbers, put your comments in this section. This forecast has to be routinely updated and used in your annual budget preparation and communications with water users. This is a great way to communicate to water users why water rates might need to increase, or what sort of projects you think will be coming up, and why they're needed, because you have actually looked at the assets and assessed their condition. So it's a great communication tool as well. And this is really the culmination of the whole business plan that we're looking for, is your funding strategy going forward, and that you're incorporating it into your annual budgeting process. So as you see, this is Part C. And at this point, I would like to transfer you over. I'd like to stop sharing for a moment and let somebody else talk. So
Thanks,
Sarah is here to discuss your wastewater fiscal sustainability plan.
Great, thank you.
Here also, can you make yourself a presenter, or you want me to make you a presenter?
I think I can do it. Let me
Okay,
see.
wonderful. Yep, we can see your
You
slide.
can see it? All right, great. All right, so the next piece that we're going to talk about today is the Fiscal Sustainability Plan, which is really the wastewater side of what we're here to talk about. So the Fiscal Sustainability Plan covers the assets for the wastewater system. So the first question to be answered by the co-op would be, which type of system do you have? So is it a septic system? And that's shown on the left here, where you have your homes connected to a septic tank and then to a leach field. And there could be one home connected to an individual septic tank. There could be multiple homes connected to a community septic tank. There could be multiple tanks leading into a community leach field. So many configurations possible. Or are your homes connected to a municipal wastewater treatment facility? So this would be a public sewer system that you'd be connected to. So in that kind of scenario, you can see on the right, there would be pipes connected to a pump station that would eventually pump to a wastewater treatment facility. So in order to understand what assets are in your system, you need to know which type of system you have. So that would be the first question to answer. And then once you know that, you can determine what the assets are. So I've identified in this slide a few of the different assets for the two different types. So depending on if it's septic or if it's a public sewer system, you may have, in both systems, you'd have piping. You may have, a pump station. You may have a septic tank. You may have a leach field. So all of those different things would be assets for your wastewater system. So some similarities, to the drinking water side, you may have pumps in both scenario, you have pipes in both scenario, but definitely different systems. So for the Fiscal Sustainability Plan, the requirement would be to identify the assets that are being funded by the grant funding. So if you have a septic system project where you're replacing piping, septic tanks, leach fields, those are the things we'd be interested in identifying for the Fiscal Sustainability Plan. And then for a public sewer system, there would be different assets that are likely either being replaced or assessed through the grant funding. So I know that some systems may be doing some closed circuit television of sewer lines. So in that case, you'd want to identify those pipes that are being videoed for reference. So it really depends on which type of project you have and which type of system you have. So the Fiscal Sustainability Plan is a spreadsheet somewhat similar to the asset management plan that we just looked at and the asset inventory. And really the goal is to identify a long-term funding strategy for the system. And that is, we're lucky enough to be able to offer the grant funding through this program, but grant funding is certainly not guaranteed, and we don't expect to be able to have the funding available to provide grants in the future. So DES is making this investment into these systems, and we look forward to the communities being able to go forward with a sustainable plan to be able to fund the long-term life of these assets and then also the eventual replacement, which is necessary. So the information that you're going to need for the Fiscal Sustainability Plan, it's pretty similar to what we saw in the asset inventory. So you're going to need information like the costs and the lifetime of the assets, and where you can find this information is depending on what information you have about the new infrastructure being installed. You can look to the manufacturers of the materials. You also are working with an engineer who is very knowledgeable about the systems and what the lifetime would be of the assets, as well as the costs. And as Shelley mentioned, we are seeing somewhat high inflation at this point, so costs can be difficult to pin down, and I would certainly plan on the high side for things, especially expecting that as time goes on, inflation will continue to be a component of the cost. And then similar to in the asset inventory, we'd want to have a condition and impact score for each of the assets. So this is really kind of a qualitative asset assessment that you would be doing for the assets. So typically for things that are being installed as part of the grant funding, you'd have likely an excellent condition score to start because they'd be brand new. And then if you're doing something like assessment of the sewers where you do the video assessment, you'll probably get some condition information out of that you can utilize in this Fiscal Sustainability Plan. And then the impact score would be, what is the impact of that particular asset if it were to fail? So for example, if it was the only pump station for the entire cooperative and all of the wastewater flows through that pump station and there's no backup pump station, there's no generator, if that fails, we're out of luck. That's a really critical asset. So you'd have a really catastrophic impact of that. And then another example might be if there's a single, one pipe fails, but it only is the wastewater for, one house. Maybe that's not as catastrophic because you have an alternative that you can figure out for that one home. So it's really a qualitative assessment though, and it depends on what your system configuration is and what kind of redundancy you have within the system. Before we get to the next presentation, I did just want to show an example of what these spreadsheets look like. So I will pull one up. I have an example for if the system is either, as I mentioned, the septic or the public sewer system. So let me pull those up and you can see sort of an example of how we'd fill that information out. So here is the septic side. So this is a my own, this system doesn't actually exist, but I put in here just some generic kind of information. So this would be a system that has 4 different septic tanks that serve different units within the park, and then different leach fields, different distribution boxes, different sewer pipes, and then you'd want to know the year that they're installed, the estimated useful life, and then you'd be able to determine the remaining useful life. So something installed in 1999 that has an estimated useful life of 30 years, there would be 7 years left of that remaining life. And then you also want to put in here what you're estimating the cost to replace that item would be, expecting that at some point in the future there will have to be a project undertaken to replace that as everything reaches the end of its useful life. So you're thinking, by 2029, you want to have this dollar value available to be able to replace that asset. And then similarly, you'd have these condition scores and the impact of failure. Those are the 2 qualitative assessment pieces that I was mentioning. And then you can calculate the risk score based on that. So the higher the risk score, the more trouble you might be in if that particular asset is needing to be replaced. So you look at these risk scores and that helps you determine what's going to be sort of the most bang for your buck as far as replacement. The higher the score, the more it needs to be replaced. I'll pull up we have an example for if you were connected to a sewer system, you might see a little bit of a different group of assets. There may be more sewer pipe, more pumps, and maybe a generator, different things that you might see depending on what your system is. But a similar idea here where you'd fill out that kind of information, and then also where you anticipate the funding coming from for replacing that item eventually when it reaches the end of its useful life. So the requirement here is to fill out this information with the assets that the grant is funding. So that would be, as I mentioned, the different things depending on what type of project you have. And that's the end of my slides, and I'll leave it to the next presenter, and I think that's Shelley.
Hi, Shelley. I think that you're the next presenter, right?
Yes, thanks.
Okay.
Just a moment. Here we go. So just wanted to mention that for the next session, you'll need some items to be able to fill out your expenses, revenues, and debts. It's good to have a representative financial statement, to have your budget, because I'll show you in a minute. You'd like your budget for your previous year, your actual expenditures for your previous year, and your budget going into the next year. It's a good idea to take a look at your general ledger to see if there are any types of expenses that are being attributed to other things that really should be captured under your water system expenses, or perhaps your sewer or septic system expenses for your Fiscal Sustainability Plan. You'll want to have a summary of your debts that your treasurer can put together for you, including interest rates and expected date of loans being fulfilled and completed and paid off. And so we'll be using these items to fill out the tabs for the expenses, revenues, debt, and fiscal strategy. So this is just a screenshot of the expenses tab, part F. And as I mentioned earlier, you would be having a listing up here of routine operations and maintenance expenses. And down below, you would have general and administrative expenses. Now, these expenses might not be called out, but you might find them in your general ledger. If they're not called out and they're all just sort of lumped under professional expenses in your bookkeeping, I would recommend that you break out some accounts so you can track them better. But also, if you can't do that right now, I would just take 15% of general and administrative expenses that would apply to your water system and use that instead, just as on line 27 down here. There is a spot down here for reserve funds, and from what I've experienced, it's 27% of fixed expenditures or 90 days working capital or one debt payment down here as a go by. And so this section down here would be automatically calculated for your total expenses, which would be taken from this cell. You'd be adding your total operation and maintenance expenses that were expended last year and your budget for next year. And then your total of your water system general and administrative expenses down here. And then the number of connections would be automatically filled out. It's connected in Excel to another page. And that way you can get your expenses per connection, per water system connection, per user, and per month. And it gives you basically your water rate, which is pretty handy. This is what you'll be doing for the next session's training. So it's a good idea to try to do this before the next session. For your revenues, as I mentioned earlier in this talk, most systems don't charge for their water separately from the lot rent. And so right here you would just put the expenses, the total expenses from the previous spreadsheet, part F, into part G up here, and you would be done. If you do have other revenues that aren't shown from there, you can add them in here to to your water system expenses, and that would be your revenue for your water system. For those that do have service meters and bill separately, you can use this section and discuss your water charges and use per billing period. Finally, this is the very simple spreadsheet. It's just a summary of the debt that you have. And this, as I mentioned, is for going forward. So you would want to take a look for next year. You could add this in for your budget for next year. Let's go back. Budget for next financial year. You could put the debt in here. I would also ask that you put it in here for what you expect to take on. And finally, all of those numbers can be subtotaled up here for your expenses. So we'll just go back. This total expenses line here would be put up here. And that's just a way to let you have all of your costs in on one sheet to help your board of directors plan for paying for these expenses and repairs and replacements going forward. And I'll just say it one more time. Hope you do this every year with your budgeting cycle. And next, I'm going to stop at this point and hand this over to Eric Toledo.
Okay, so I think that I'm gonna take over. So you should be able to see my presentation. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you very much. This is Eric again. So I can just talk a little bit about some budget considerations in the next couple of slides. So the question is why budget change over time? And the reason why that happens is because there are different factors that are absolutely beyond our control. that influence our budgets, so they tend to increase right at the declined, but it could happen that they declined. The factor that influence the changes in the budget and that you have to take into consideration an inflation, depreciation, the cost. Some of the costs are fixed, but some of them are variable costs. They can change seasonally. The reserves is another factor, and new projects, like replacing uh, asset component or replacing the whole system, whatever is a water or wastewater system. So let's just talk about the inflation in very simple terms. Inflation basically is the cost of living, and the cost of living is increasing gradually. So in this graphic, you can see, for instance, a pump that has a value, and this is a Boston pump, maybe has a value of installation of $5,000, the year of installation. By the 6th year, the value of that pump, predictable value of that pump at a 3% inflation rate will be $790 more than what it costs today. So the value of the cost will be now 5,790 as opposed to 5,000, which is what we pay now. So that's the inflation factor. The second one is depreciation. In taking the same example, we have the pump, which we have a value of 5,000, and you can see that they are losing, every single asset is designed for working a number of years. So essentially they are wearing over time. And you can see that by the 3rd year, the value that used to be 5,000 now is 3,000. And so we essentially lost a value of $2,000 for that pump at the beginning of year number 3. And by the end of year number 6, we totally lose the value of that pump. So what that means is that, we have to replace that pump for a new one, and then, we start all over again. In the case of the different kind of cost, we have the fixed cost and the variable cost. Some of the costs of running your water system or wastewater system relatively stable. They don't change over time. Then you can see the fixed assets like the aligned, across the graphic. So you can see the graphic that goes from January to December, and you can see the gray line, which represent the salaries, as a relatively stable or fixed cost. The same apply for the reserves. There's a steady amount that you put aside, and some of the taxes are usually the same. So those are considered fixed costs. But there are some costs that change over time due to the fact that you are perhaps providing or supplying more water to your customers, or you are taking more wastewater from your customers. So that usually happens seasonally, and they are called variable costs. So you have a combination of those things that make your budget fluctuate over time. The other thing are the reserves. Sometimes they are hidden costs, you don't see them, but they are there. And the idea is that you create this kind of reserves in order to be able to be prepared for any kind of, operation maintenance situation. So it's recommended having at least through 2 months of the operation and maintenance allocation for the year. You have also the emergency reserves, which are usually, money that you need to have available as a liquid or as a cash, so you can use it right away when you have a contingency. You also have the short-term asset that usually you transfer the cost to your customers. You have the debt payment, which sometimes is required by funding institutions. So you have to cover like 100% of yearly fee, if that's what you pay it, or if you pay it in a by yearly basis, then you have to have that for that amount of time. The capital reserve, which is probably one of the biggest budget items, usually between 1 and 2% is recommended of the cost of your system every year. And the other thing are the project expenses. Project expenses is something that you have to do because you need to in order to provide services to your customers. This case, for instance, for this community, and this is a real example, this community depends heavily on a well, and the well has this submersible pump, which is a critical asset according to the definition that Shelley explained it to us before, because without this pump, the system won't be able to provide water to the customers. So the cost of that, the current cost is $5,000. So it's the same example that we used before. And the useful life is 20 years. That's what we estimated. And we have 10 years left. So the cost of replacing that will raise, to $5,200. So you have to take that into consideration. You have 10 years, and that's what you're going to end paying next. Now, so what I wanted to just finish with is, what is your strategy as a water, or wastewater supplier to your customers? Very often you see that there are systems that are operating on a contingency situation, on a contingency mode. And what is advisable, recommended for a system to be sustainable is to move from that contingent situation to a more planning stage. And in order to do that, you have to make those adjustments. And that's the whole purpose of working with the business plan. You can make those adjustments by incorporating and implementing a business plan as presented. So this is my last slide, and I just wanted to thank you for attending the training. I don't know if we have any other presentation that is lining up this.
I have a couple of reminders to make.
Okay, perfect.
So
Go
thanks,
ahead.
Eric. So the first thing I will say is that there will be a post test available on the website where this recording is posted, and that should be taken and sent to Eric Toledo, and that will help get you the credit for taking this course. And then the other reminder would be that there is actually a certification form that is going to be due back to me. And on that certification form, it is required that you indicate the date that this course was attended and who attended it. So please use the information to fill that in.